Ladies and gentlemen, we have far too many distinguished and noteworthy people in the room for me to mention them all, but I will say that we're extremely delighted to see such a great turnout from the diplomatic community, the academic community, the political community, and the bureaucratic community, everybody in Ottawa who can affect the thinking in this country about these issues is here today, and I salute you all for coming. Thank you. Those of you, by the way, who would like to tweet about today's event while it's going on, we certainly encourage you to do so. And the hashtag that we're using for today's event is, I think, Russia's Challenge. Hashtag Russia's Challenge. And we are ML Institute on Twitter. So please feel free to let people outside the room know about the things that you're hearing that you think are particularly noteworthy. And now it's my distinct pleasure to turn to our keynote speaker for today's event, Tom Nichols. Tom also almost didn't make it because he learned what every Canadian learns at his or her mother's knee, that you cannot trust Air Canada. And he was getting on a train in Providence and got an email saying that his flight had been canceled. We managed to pull things together. He got here, I think had 5 minutes to make a connection in the Montreal airport, but he managed, and I think that's a sign of his commitment to being here with us today. So I think we should, anybody who can overcome Air Canada's resistance to travel. Yeah, no, I'm not done yet, Tom. That was just about Air Canada. Now it's about you. Tom's reputation and profile are so distinguished that I'm sure everybody in this audience knows who he is. But for the record, let me just remind you that Tom is Professor of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College and an adjunct professor in the Harvard Extension School. In his Washington days, Tom was a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That's their CSIS, not our CSIS, a consultant to the U.S. government and a research analyst for private industry. Later, he served as an advisor on foreign and defense affairs to the late U.S. Senator John Heinz of Pennsylvania. And in what is surely his most untoppable qualification, he is also a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. His most recent book is Death of Expertise, The Campaign Against Established Knowledge and Why It Matters. Tom, could I please invite you to come to the podium and address the meeting? And perhaps the best way to frame Tom's talk is in the time-honored Jeopardy fashion. If Russia's challenge to North American and European security is the answer, what, Tom, is the question?
Well, thank you for having me, and I don't want to blame Air Canada. I'm going to assume it was Russian sabotage, but I made it despite their efforts. First, of course, the first thing I should tell you is that I don't represent the views of the United States government. I'm here speaking in my own capacity and from my own views. I was asked to talk about the view from America. And the first thing I would say about Russia's challenge to the West, because it is to the West, it's not just the United States or to the Baltic states, it is an all-fronts attack on the West. But I'm sorry to say that I think that there is no view from America, but there are several views from America about this issue. Some Americans see this whole issue of a Russian attack against the West as nonsense, as politically motivated, primarily as a means of trying to undermine the Trump administration, a very inside baseball kind of Washington problem, the thing that we old school Cold Warriors can't let go of. The president himself encourages this, I think, when he's on the road, when he says, would it be so bad if I got along with Russia and Putin? And so right off the bat, there is a segment of the American public that just does not take this very seriously. And I think that's unfortunate. There's a second view that sees this as somewhat important but not crucial. That if you talk to this segment of Americans, you will get an answer something like, well, of course the Russians, the wiggle word we use here is meddled, that the Russians meddled, but that's just Russians doing what Russians do. And that it wasn't particularly effective or important. It's just another day in the big jungle. And I think, again, there are concerns. You can never separate this from the extremely sharp and divided partisan situation in the United States right now. And so, again, for a lot of these folks, the answer is that, yes, the Russians are always out there causing mischief, but it did not affect our elections. Now, I actually take a third view that I think most of the people that I know in the community of Russia scholars and Russia experts in the United States take, which is that I think that Russia's recent activity in the past few years has been unprecedented, approaching an act of war, and a direct attack on American and allied political institutions. And so far, they've gotten away with it. Now, again, it's difficult to pull this apart from the partisan situation. I understand there's some things going on in Washington today, and so let me again say how glad I am to be in Canada, and may I stay.
Yeah.
Forever. That's,
You just have to go to Roxham Road.
I have resisted for quite a while the notion that the Russians, despite my sense that this, again, is essentially an act of war, that this is over the line. Now, I should say about my own background, I came up as a young Soviet expert, and the fact that I just used that word tells you how old I am. And I would say that I was never, that I grew up as a early trained Cold Warrior. I argued for better relations between the West and Russia for the Yeltsin years and even into the first few years of the Putin regime. And I was finally talked out of that by Vladimir Putin and his activities. Nonetheless, I too resisted the notion that the Russians had somehow changed the American election outcome, and until I see better evidence. Now, there's a book that has just been released from Oxford University Press. I'm always glad to give them a shout out since I work with them as well, called Cyber War, in which a case, Kathleen Hall Jamieson makes the case that, and as much as we can be certain, she would argue that it's highly likely that Russian propaganda actually swung the American election. I have not read the book yet. I haven't reached a judgment about this. I don't think you need to reach that conclusion, again, in order to accept that what the Russians have done was, again, to me, functionally an act of aggression against the West that really went beyond the kind of hijinks that we pulled on each other, quite honestly, during the Cold War. There were limits during the Cold War. There were lines that could not be crossed during the Cold War. And what strikes me about the current Russian situation is that they see no limits whatsoever. The Russians seem to see no restraining influence on their activity at all. And this worries me because I suspect that before the next few years are out, they will test us not only politically in the cyber realm and in the espionage world, but I suspect they're going to test us militarily somehow, probably through a terrible miscalculation about whether or not we're capable of responding to them. I also wanted to point out that my view, I try to take a larger view about this because I think Americans have become obsessive about this one issue. Did the Russians meddle, a word I don't like. I prefer the word attack. Did the Russians attack American political institutions? Not just our electoral system, not just working through propaganda and falsifying stories and other disinformation efforts. Did they attack our political parties, which to me are a part of our political institutions? And I think the answer is undoubtedly. Through their, I think one thing that Americans, been an interesting change to see in America, that I said years ago that WikiLeaks was essentially a subsidiary of the Russian intelligence service. A lot of people didn't like hearing that years ago, and it's nice to live long enough to see your outrageous opinion become the conventional wisdom. But it took a little while. But I think we've become overly obsessive about this notion of an attack on our political institutions, and we've forgotten that this is actually a full spectrum attack on us and all of our allies, and throughout the West, broadly conceived, even beyond NATO. And I think this is, again, lost in the immense insular, inward-looking partisan bickering that is obsessing Washington and the American people right now. And I think that's unfortunate. The question to me is, what is it the Russians are trying to achieve? Because one objection you'll get in the United States to all of this is, well, so the Russians are, dumping propaganda on us. I think that the original Russian intent, by the way, insofar as we can divine it, was that their initial mischief 2 years ago was to undermine what they thought was going to be an incoming Hillary Clinton administration. I think initially they weren't actually trying to swing the American election or affect its outcome. They were simply trying to, because we all know about the warm, cordial relations between Vladimir Putin and Hillary Clinton. I think they saw themselves as weighting down an incoming Clinton administration with scandals and questions and classified materials and stolen emails and all of that stuff. And I think that was just, again, for the Russians, a kind of a low-cost, moderate payoff move. And then things started to get out of control. And I think that their goal moved from undermining a Clinton administration to actually seeing if they could move the American public back and forth and whipsaw them between these candidates. Now, with that said, I've made this argument elsewhere as well, that the goal is not to actually promote a Russian line. This is one difference, I think, between the current Russian approach and the old Soviet approach. One thing that was almost reassuring about the Soviets is how predictable they were. Their propaganda was so bad, and it was so predictable, I could have written it myself. It shows you what a facile and easy form of communication it was that, those of us who studied the old Soviet Union could start speaking to each other as though we were party members, we simply not tolerating any of this right deviationism from our, friends among the wreckers. And this is different. I don't think there is any Russian line that they're pushing. I think rather Putin's goal and the Russian goal is not to convince Western societies of something. It is to convince them of nothing. It is to paralyze them. It is to completely overwhelm the critical faculties of the average Western citizen to the point of incoherence. I did a few speaking tours in the Czech Republic over the past few years, working with the State Department. And if we think it's bad here in the United States and Canada and here in North America, to go to Central Europe I'm sure as our Baltic colleagues can tell you, the amount of Russian disinformation and general information, interference in the information sphere is staggering. I mean, it makes what's happening in the United States look almost like a rehearsal. To go to Central Europe is to be in an environment where Russian disinformation falls out of the sky like acid rain constantly. And talking to young people in places like Central Europe, and I went from the Polish border to across the country, it's having an effect that young people increasingly, both here in the United States and in Europe, say things like, well, you know, a lot of things can be true, and maybe nothing is true. And, you know, the Russians, well, they lie, but everybody lies. And there's really no reason to believe in anything. This, to me, this is the goal of the Russian effort, is to completely annihilate the civic engagement of a coming generation of young people in the democracies. It is to make them pull away from public life and civic engagement and to throw up their hands and to say, nothing matters. Anything could be a lie. Anything could be true. Information has no provenance. It simply exists. This is a problem in general that I wrote about in my last book, that young people in particular think that things in cyberspace and on the internet exist in the same way that planets and stars and asteroids exist, because they're just there. They're not the result of any kind of human agency. And I think that this actually serves a Russian purpose. It serves three Russian purposes. First, it makes the Russian regime seem not so bad. It makes the Russian regime seem normal. Well, you know, Putin's a bad guy, but, you know, we've heard terrible things about, you know, Hillary. When I was in the Czech Republic, somebody said, well, what about, you know, Hillary Clinton running a child prostitution ring out of a pizza restaurant? It was an interesting moment, because the young man who asked me, I said, we're not going to talk about it. I said, it's a fake story. And I looked at him and I said, and he kind of smiled and I said, and you know it's a fake story, don't you? And he said, well, I'm just asking questions. I said, that is the eternal dodge of the propagandist. I said, look, you're a very intelligent young man. You know this story is fake. He says, well, it could be, but, and finally afterwards he came up and he said, I said, you were just trying to see if you could link the word Hillary Clinton to the word pedophile enough times. And cleverly, the young man nodded and he went, yeah. He said, I just don't like her. I said, well, there's a whole audience of people that, you know, I said, you know this is a fake story. And he said, maybe. Again, I don't think, I think that that is part of, that's one of the Russian goals. Say, well, Putin's bad, but you have a bunch of, you know, racist, pedophile, whatever's running the Western governments. The second, I think, is to split apart the Western alliance, to drain the values away through this kind of disinformation. Freedom, liberty, what does all that mean? These are just words. Words don't mean anything. I have plenty of freedom. I am an autonomous person. I can go to the internet or turn on a radio station. I don't, you know, the notion that one system is better than the other. I don't really need these Canadians in my country tromping around, or these boorish Americans clumping through my town. You know, this is that just puts me in danger, and I don't really have any issue or beef with anybody else. And I think it's meant to pull apart the Western alliance by dissolving the values that underlie it. Now, the old Soviet goal was to replace those values with, you know, sort of insane post-Bolshevik nonsense about real socialism and actually existing socialism and the fraternal brotherhood of society and all that I won't use the word, but as Ronald Reagan once said, it has deep roots in our agricultural community. And finally, on a very practical level, I think the goal is to paralyze the West so that the Russians have greater freedom of action to do whatever it is they want to do. It's to create an open space, an open playing field. And in part, again, not because the Russians are the old Soviets. The old Soviet Union had a globe-spanning ideology, and it worked very hard to spread that and to gain new adherents. Every new allied state to the Soviet Union was one more piece of evidence that the Soviet idea was legitimate. The Russians, I think, want greater latitude to act, in part because they are a completely transactional regime, and almost all of that regime's activities are based on the fact that it is run by a mafia family whose boss needs to stay in power. And there are many ways that boss stays in power. Primarily, he does that by providing goods and services to his lieutenants and capos. Partly, it's by keeping his own people scared of him. Or in classic mafia fashion, keeps part of the population afraid of him and the other part of the population grateful for his largesse. And I think when he is limited in his activity, when he's limited in what he can do in places like Crimea, if he had been limited there, or Syria, or Ukraine, that undermines his stability. And in the end, I would argue that I actually don't believe, I should pause here for a moment and say, I don't believe that Putin is a Russian nationalist or a neo-Soviet Bolshevist or any of those things. I think the two ways I think of Putin, one is that he is a Soviet nostalgist, which is that he does not want the old Soviet ideology back. He just wants 1975 back. Those were good days for him. And if you think back to 1975, the Soviet Union's on the ascent. It's a power practically equal to the United States. The United States in 1975, hard to recall that we were once worse off than we are now, but we once were, with a president and a vice president that no one had elected. An unprecedented moment in American politics. We had just been defeated in Vietnam. Our economy was a shambles. We were suffering from a word that my students, every time students tell me how awful everything is, I say, the fact that you don't understand what the word stagflation means tells me that you don't know how bad it can be. And I think Putin just looks back fondly on that. This is a guy who tears up when he hears the Soviet national anthem. So I think he kind of wants, I think in some ways we're dealing with a man who's having the most dangerous midlife crisis in history. So I think that's part of it, but also I think he is riding the tiger. I think somewhere around, now, and I should add, by the way, around 2001, 2002, it may be the worst professional mistake I ever made, but I said, this Putin guy, he might not be so bad. I think there were a lot of us at the time who said, seems like a kind of a bureaucrat, might be, impose a little order on the Federation, repair some of the bilateral kind of improvisation that Yeltsin had done. I think by the time, whether I was wrong about that or whether Putin changed, it was irrelevant, I think, by the time he ran for a third term. And I think that third term, when he came back to power, was his way of saying, I don't feel safe unless I'm in charge. And he's not going to leave. That's the end of it. He has decided he must rule for the rest of his life. And he is, to use that wonderful expression, he is riding a tiger from which he dare not dismount now. And so I think that is the freedom of action that he seeks in the international community. So now that I've been completely depressing about all of this, let me make it worse. I do not believe there is a government or official political remedy to this. In the United States in particular, I am very concerned about how the Americans talk about government solutions to this that I think violate are straight up violations of our First Amendment rights. We have to control Facebook. We have to control Twitter. The government has to control social media. This, to me, as a limited government conservative, and there are a couple of us left, I find appalling. It is anathema to me. When people ask me, what should we do, though, about people being lied to on Facebook? My answer is stop getting your news from Facebook. Tell your friends not to get their news from Facebook. Teachers should be telling their students, don't get your news. I have a Facebook account. Everybody has a Facebook account. It's like having a credit card now. It's just one of those things. I have a very active Twitter account, as some of you may know. But I think that the only thing that will stop this is social pressure, peer pressure, public intellectuals finally taking on their responsibility to shout back at the crowd, which I think public intellectuals have been loath to do because the charge of becoming an elitist, and particularly in the United States, is now worse than being called a communist. And I think as well that there has to be some kind of return, either, again, through schooling, through education, the universities stepping up and taking their responsibility to restore the notion of civic virtue, to talk about what makes the West worth defending. You cannot solve this by having the government censor Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or any of those things. The information sphere is simply too porous to control, and every effort to control it will result in a decline in our civil liberties. So it's a bigger problem than that. We have, I guess, it's a way of saying we just have to become better people and raise a better generation behind us. But we can't become the thing just as during the Cold War, and I'll end here, just as during the Cold War, we cannot become the thing we're fighting against. And we really have to take care not to let that happen. I don't think this situation is irretrievable, but I think we are in for a long slog here, just as we were here in this second strange Cold War that we're in, and I think we are in a second Cold War now, that this is going to be a long slog that requires relying on our values as members of Western democracies. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, as Alex Trebek would say, can you phrase that as a question? Ladies and gentlemen, there was so much material there. I have to say, though, that I was particularly struck by what Tom said about both the predictability of the old Soviet propaganda and the date of 1975, because I don't know why this came to mind, but it did. In 1976, the first Parti Québécois government was elected in Canada. And I remember very well the advisor on foreign affairs to René Lévesque, Yves Michaud, was asked about an editorial that appeared in Pravda on the occasion of the election of this government, and the reaction of the Soviet establishment was, they're merely a petty bourgeois nationalist movement. That entirely predictable response. And a journalist put a microphone in Yves Michaud's face and said, "So, Mr. Michaud, is this just a petty bourgeois government?" And Michaud looked off in the distance for a moment, and then he said, "Bourgeois, oui, mais pourquoi petit?" Okay. Thank you, Tom, for that indispensable context for our discussion.